Hey everybody, good to see you, and I guess you can hear me. And today, I guess I sent out an email around 3 o'clock or so, so hopefully you received that. And so the exam was just launched today, this afternoon, and all of the essay questions on the exam are in that email. So basically, those are to guide you. Um, let you do a little research before you actually take the exam. So just to hopefully that'll be helpful. So today, and I know you don't have a. The other thing is you also have all except the last two quizzes available to you now. Those are multiple choice, so 10 points, 10 questions, 20 points apiece. I would, I don't know, if it were me, I would probably study those exam questions and then take the quizzes. It's up to you. That's probably maybe the surest way to do well. Today, I'm going to talk about at least a couple of items, at least a couple of chapters, and I'm looking around trying to figure out what are we going to, what should I cover in the amount of time that we have left, which is today and Wednesday, and Monday, right? Today, Wednesday, and next Monday. So week, 3 more class periods, and so I'm covering these not in necessarily in chronological or in order of the book, and I know you haven't read ahead um, to understand what these are. So I've got a lot of notes, and um, I'm going to subject you to my horrible writing, but hopefully you can read these. I want to start off by talking today about Chapter 24 of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, or just the topic of Indian gaming. And then I want to move on to um, a topic that I want to make sure we get, which is natural resources. It's Chapter 26. And then, if we're able to get through natural resources tonight, I'm going to start up cultural resources. But I'm kind of doubtful that we'll be able to get past, get through two. Maybe we will. Your textbook, either I'm like more familiar with some things than others in this area, or your textbook is kind of intentionally light. I don't know really which, but um, your textbook is fairly light on the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and the natural resources. Um, so I'm probably going to include some things that you won't necessarily see in the readings, but the readings are good. You should do the readings anyway. It's just fairly the natural resources part basically is a focus on water in your textbook. It doesn't cover things like wildlife and fisheries, unfortunately. Um, and I might add that later, but we'll see how we do getting through this. The water issues are kind of complicated, but let's get started with Indian gaming. So let's do this. Let's start off with what can you all tell me about um, the area of Indian gaming? What do you know about it? Um, how long has it been around? How long has it been in Oklahoma? Anybody want to start off? Gaming is one of the things that got me interested in Indian policy and um, Native American geography, if you will. And of course, gaming itself, Indian gaming, is very much tied to place. And as you probably, if you're like me, you were told for your entire life that there really aren't any reservations in Oklahoma. So, how can you possibly have Indian gaming, things like this? Well, we know that's really just a matter of semantics to say we don't have reservations in Oklahoma, because we have what the law would call many informal reservations. They are essentially reservations, except for being called, by the government, designated reservations. Um, so when did Indian gaming get started in Oklahoma? Anybody have any idea?
About 15 to 20 years, hadn't it, maybe?
There was a task force.
Let me turn your volume up. I couldn't really hear that. Go ahead, Steve.
It's been around about,
We had an Indian gaming task force, like at least a decade prior to any real work getting done, but I don't know if that had anything to do with Oklahoma.
So what would you say in terms
I
of
would
dates?
say I thought it was the 80s
The 80s?
for the task force.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it was actually in Oklahoma. You started seeing bingo halls that attracted, people from outside of the area in the late 70s. So, I mean, at least I remember that. And so there was a process. Oklahoma, of course, is kind of an innovator. Oklahoma tribes have been innovators in many ways. Tribal license plates, for example, got started here. A lot of the Indian gaming activity was sort of tested here. A lot of the tobacco sales stuff was sort of tested here in Oklahoma. Um, in other words, lots of tribes were sort of testing the waters back in the 70s, mostly in the 70s and the 80s. Um, but gaming really took off in the 80s, and we're going to talk about sort of where it went. And in Oklahoma, there was a sort of there was an inhibition on gaming, basically, until about 2004. And if you know much about Oklahoma politics, one of the issues in the state was whether or not the state would engage in state-run gaming activity. And the anti-gambling forces, the anti-gambling interests were fairly powerful in keeping Oklahoma from becoming a state that allowed the same types of games that Indian casinos would be able to provide or allow. Um, we'll have to kind of get into it, but I used to bet people, when we would every now and then we would get a ballot question, and a ballot question like, should we have a state lottery? And the last time I was cocky enough to open my mouth and say, this will never pass, I was dead wrong. And that was a good thing. So, but what happened is, well, let me come back to this. I'll come back to I'll get into it with some of the notes, but your textbook chapter is called the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, all right? And let me up here for you. And I'm going directly to my ugly notes here, but hey, they're authentic. I'll put it that way. Maybe not as easy to read, but certainly less boring than PowerPoint. So the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is what your chapter is based on, and it was a federal law that was signed in 1988. I remember it well, and sorry, my brother calls me all the time. This very same class. I don't know why. Anyway. All right. So the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was, your textbook starts off by saying, well, a lot of people think the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act started gaming, on Indian country, or it created a situation where tribes could start gaming. That's kind of true, but certainly didn't begin Indian gaming. If you talk to somebody and they give you the cultural answer, they'll say, well, native peoples were, have been gambling forever, and wagering and that sort of thing's often part of a lot of native people's cultures, especially in plains tribes. So this is why you have, it's not considered to be a morally defective activity in any sense. Oh, you can't see that, can you, Steve? A little better? I don't know, maybe not. I'll put these on PDF for you so you can actually read them. Can you all read those, by the way, online? You can? Okay. I would maximize this, but then I would lose my ability to move around here. So hopefully that works. But the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was actually it's a limiting law, and in a lot of ways, you will see that it parallels laws like Public Law 280. All right, and in other words, it's almost, there's almost a question of whether or not it's constitutional. Okay, but we know that Congress tends to get its way when it comes to Indian policy. So there's always like an exception of some sort. Well, what the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act does is it provides a compromise to allow Indian tribes to provide or run types of games, types of revenue producing games, and most of the time we assume Las Vegas style casino games, and that's obviously the goal for most tribes who want to get into Indian gaming. By the way, not all tribes bother with Indian gaming. Not all tribes are open to it, and there are some tribes that have absolutely rejected the possibility of doing it on moral grounds. But it is also proved to be probably the most successful form of development in Indian country ever that has benefited the tribes. And of course, we're talking about basically an entertainment development, entertainment industry development. That's what we're looking at. And in fact, now, I could say that I remember Oklahoma in the early 80s when the state tax commission would harass and conduct raids in the little convenience stores and that sort of thing that were trying to provide Class 2 gaming, what we now call Class 2 gaming, which is just peanuts. And the state of Oklahoma was trying to push its authority on American Indian tribes within the state. Remember, Oklahoma is not a PL 280 state, yet it's almost like prior to 2020 and prior to the McGirt and the Murphy decisions. Before that, it's almost like Oklahoma was sort of a PL 280 state on steroids, sort of like PL 280 plus, all right? And that it had assumed authority over Indian country in many ways. I mean, the state of Oklahoma had an Oklahoma Indian Affairs Commission that the tribes didn't want to participate with. They just had it. The state had this commission. Now, anyway, kind of getting off track, but in the late 70s and early 80s, mid 80s, tribes in Oklahoma, particularly in central Oklahoma, north of Stillwater, started engaging in gaming that was essentially, they called it bingo, and but it was it was made up of games that were lucrative enough to attract busloads of senior citizens from Wichita, that sort of thing. So they were they were actually doing something that was actually making money. It was employing their people and generally not hurting anybody, So the federal government during the late 70s, early 80s started promoting or at least encouraging tribes to do things like this. Not just gambling, but during the Reagan administration, it was all sort of hands off. The federal government was encouraging tribes to find ways to keep the federal government from spending money on them. Trying to allow them to go their own way. And some of them tried, and sometimes states would interfere. And we'll see that how this all got started here in a little bit. So anyway, here are some notes. If you can read my scribbles, and these are not even my good notes, but basically what the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act does, or IGRA as they say, IGRA was passed in 1988 in response to, as it always happens, in response to a Supreme Court decision. And the Supreme Court decision, somebody can guess this. In the Supreme Court decision that prompted a federal statute, do you suppose the Indians won or lost? Think back to like ex parte Crow Dog. Okay, so the tribe won the case, and in response, Congress comes out with a regulatory measure. So this was, again, another example of that. So IGRA is passed, and when it came out, a lot of tribes, they weren't surprised by this. In fact, the federal government under this would have been the Bush administration at this time, and the tribes were actually involved in the development of the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. So it's not like the government threw this on them. They were actively involved, and so the point of it was to sort of settle the disputes between tribes and states. States didn't want Indian tribes to be providing casino-style games like you would find in Nevada or Atlantic City. So what the federal government, or what the federal law did, was it allowed a way for tribes to engage in gaming of some sort, but it required them to communicate and actually to create a compact, an agreement with the state where they were located. All right, so you can imagine states aren't the same. States have different cultures, and some states were very eager to get tribal entities within their states to engage in gaming. And one of those states was Connecticut. Okay, and in Connecticut wound up having the largest Indian casino and the most successful one until it actually, I think, went bankrupt a few years ago. Probably due to mismanagement or something, but it was a huge casino, just like an hour's drive outside of New York City. So, good location, good geographical location can mean gaming is very lucrative. Tribes in states where casino gambling was considered to be, morally corrupt or morally, not something that the state would like to sign off on, ran into some issues, some difficulties. And then there were some states like Oklahoma, which were really, and Oklahoma's got to be kind of the unique case here. Oklahoma has a lot of different tribes, and because of the different sizes of the historical land bases of those tribes, it created a very, very different or uneven playing field for those tribes to engage in gaming. Just a kind of a side note. All right, any questions so far? Sometimes I get carried away and I don't ask you for questions. All right, so anyway, in 1988, you get this law that's passed, and in the original law, the states, so that if a tribe wanted to participate in a form of gaming that would be considered casino-style gaming, then it would have to have a compact. It would have to have an agreement, formal agreement with the state where it was located. I guess what I need to do is define these classes first. I didn't do that. So let me zip forward and I'll come back to this page. I want to see here, class 2. These are awful, aren't they? Here we go. All right, so I want to go to this page real quick. All right, so the IGRA, as it was passed, created what it referred to as 3 classes of gaming. All right, and the class 1 gaming is, basically raffles at powwows. And if you've been to a powwow, you've probably seen people, selling tickets, and then, you win prizes, you win a blanket or something like that. It's more of a cultural thing that's, maybe pan-Indian tribe, but it's something that the government, state government or the federal government really don't want anything to do with. Good, that's good. So class 1 games are just social games, traditional games, raffles at powwows mostly, and those have the exclusive jurisdiction of the tribes. So here we are, basically we're talking about jurisdiction. Okay, who has jurisdiction over regulating gaming or even allowing gaming? Because if you had before this, if you had a casino style gambling operation running illegally in your state, you would be hit with a felony. Okay, felony charge. This is why the mafia, basically ran casino-style gaming in states that didn't allow it, and maybe some states that did. I don't know, but anyway, you have, this was considered a shady business. Well, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act established something called the Class 2 gaming, which was intended to sort of encompass what tribes had begun to engage in during the 70s and the early 80s. And that's what I was referring to, like, the bingo, the Oto, Missouri bingo place in Red Rock, Oklahoma, just up the road from Stillwater, was one that I was, drove by. Another one at White Eagle, right up the road toward Ponca City, and on the Ponca, the old Ponca Reservation. These small tribes started engaging in bingo halls and what they called high stakes bingo. All right, so those operations were entertaining enough to begin to attract out of state visitors and revenue. So the Class 2 gaming was referred to as bingo type games, and this is what Oklahoma had until, you can see, 2004. 2004 is the year I made the big bet with everybody and lost. Okay, so state of Oklahoma will never, ever pass a lottery measure. We will not allow a lottery measure because that's going to open the state up to Class 3 gaming. And, the anti-gambling interest launched a sort of last-ditch, at the very last moment, PR campaign on television, but it didn't work. Anybody know why? Okay, so basically, I'm sorry, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. This is an exciting topic to me. So Class 2 gaming is stuff like bingo. And then if you were to drive around before the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and go to these casinos and ask them what they're doing, you would also see these machines that look kind of like one arm. They look like slot machines, one arm bandits, whatever you call them. And you would see things that resembled roulette. All right. Now those are slot machines and roulette, blackjack. Those sorts of games are considered casino-style gambling. They're called Class 3 gaming. The big difference between Class 2 gaming and Class 3 gaming is Class 2 gaming doesn't have a house that you're betting against. All right. So the Class 2 gaming is just basically, there's a cash prize and, you win that. But the tribes were innovative. They came up with, before they could get Class 3 gaming, they came up with basically these sort of ways to do Class 3 gaming that technically weren't. So you could go to these bingo places and you could get pull tabs and what they called bingo roulette and bingo blackjack. And, anyway, I don't know how serious those were. Now, card games were sort of a gray area. And they could be authorized by the state and not prohibited if they weren't prohibited by state law, and if they could be played anywhere in the state as long as games were played using state rules, etc. So basically, the Class 2 gaming allows tribes to engage in sort of low stakes gambling, and Class 2 gaming is regulated by the tribe and by the National Indian Gaming Commission, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, Class 2 gaming is sort of where the tribes got started. Of course, they wanted to get into Class 3 gaming. And the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act basically barred tribes from just jumping into that without getting permission from the states. So let's go back to this page. So the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988 forced, if tribes wanted to engage in Class 3 casino-style gambling where people were playing against the house, okay, slot machines, blackjack, roulette, which is the most lucrative type of gambling. All right, you're going to make more money people betting against the house than betting against one another. If they wanted to engage in that, they had to get permission from the state. They had to get a state tribal compact signed, and states would set the rules, and the tribes had to follow those rules. Now, the only thing that the tribes had going for them until 1996 was that if a state decided, we don't want you to gamble, and so we're not going to negotiate a state and tribal compact with you. If a state did that, according to the IGRA, they couldn't do that. If the state refused or negotiated in less than good faith, then what the tribe could do is take the state to federal court. So that the tribes could sue the states if the states did not cooperate in negotiating a state tribal compact. Okay? And you only need a state and tribal compact for Class 3 gaming. However, and you can read the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is actually a lot longer than that excerpt that's in your textbook. So that's why I said it didn't really cover a lot. Now, if for a state to for a state to be sued by an Indian tribe, remember, a state is a sovereign, right? And therefore, states enjoy sovereign immunity. You can't sue the state unless what? You can't sue the federal government unless what? Unless the federal government agrees to allow you to sue them. Or you can't sue a state unless the state agrees to allow you to sue them. And basically, there are different types of regulations and laws that, if something happens like this, then you do have the right to seek amends. But the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act really struck a nerve with a lot of people who understood state sovereignty and tribal sovereignty. And they said, wait a minute, the federal government the federal government exists to protect the states, right? Pretty much. The federal government was established to protect the states from outside forces. And that includes the protections of the 11th Amendment. Now, that's not one we talk about very much. The 11th Amendment, how many of you have heard of that one? It's basically a matter of sovereignty, state sovereignty. So the 11th Amendment is supposed to protect states from being sued by foreign countries or foreign nationals. Oh, wow, that takes us right back to what? It takes us right back to 1823. All right, so, but these, we're talking about domestic dependent nations. All right, so anyway, the states are, kind of up in arms because they say, the Constitution protects the states from being sued by other sovereigns, including Indian tribes. And so basically between 1988, if you can see this little portion that I've put up here, between 1988 and 1996, those were the boom years for Indian gaming. After 1996, the brakes were kind of put on because this is what happened. In 1996, or before, the state, the way that IGRA had it was, if a tribe, an individual tribe within a state, not all the tribes, but one individual tribe had to negotiate with the state via the governor's office. All right, so the governor's office was placed in charge of negotiating these things by the federal law. If the governor didn't want gambling in the state, didn't want Indian gambling in the state, well, it was sort of a political thing, right? So what would happen is the governors would just say, no, I'm not going to negotiate for Indian gambling. And, but the state or they would be basically protected as, heads of the sovereign. Now, the case that sort of opened all this up was the case in which the Seminole tribe, the Florida Seminole tribe, brought suit against the state of Florida because the governor would not negotiate, and it was clear he was not acting in good faith. He admitted it. But what the governor of Florida did was he stood on constitutional grounds and he said, look, the state of Florida is a sovereign state. Federal government can't, the intention of the 11th Amendment was for the federal government to protect the sovereignty of the states from being sued, right? Because who knows? Namibia might come by someday and want to sue us, or whomever, Pakistan or whatever. So anyway, this went to the Supreme Court, and guess who won? State of Florida won. Okay. And what that did was it required the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act to be amended. And basically they took out the rule that the states had to or that the tribes could take the states to court. All right, so now they can't do that. However, things kind of worked out for the better for most Indian tribes. Because why? Because gaming was so incredibly successful. Oh, by the way, that the Indian Commerce Clause, the Commerce Clause of the Constitution was the defense that the state of Florida had. Basically, don't worry about that though. So this is, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act comes out, and it's trying to create a way for states and tribes to work together so that, Indian tribes can have their casinos and states can basically regulate them, or at least states can set the rules for those casinos within their states. Yeah.
And well, like in California, the compacts have worked out great for the states too. It's improved roads to the casinos, as well as fire departments, schools, all well-lit areas, stuff, unincorporated areas that were never really touched, that were a fire hazard. Now, because the states entered in that compact, they had trucks that could reach out farther and quell fires before they get to a built-up area. Stuff
Absolutely.
like that has been, people don't see it unless you go all the way out there. But
Right.
Actually, it's really been beneficial for a lot of states.
Yep. And that's kind of the thing that they had to learn the hard way. The states initially had an argument, and I guess to really understand this, we have to look at Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, or California versus Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, just referred to as Cabazon. And that was a 1986 case, I think. Is that right? 86, maybe ruled in 87. That's the case that got the IGR going, started. But I've got more. This is supposed to be in order, but just some ideas here on Indian gaming from the Canby book. It's obviously the largest single revenue producer for tribes. What are some of the reasons why some tribes have not cashed in on gaming? Number one, location, geography, and other, in some cases, sort of traditional reasons. But anyway.
And I guess it's kind of to the point where it might be saturated, where, back to the geography, where if one tribe has it, one nation has a better location,
Yes.
it's hard to pop another brick and mortar one up to, and if it's not a very dense population that
Right.
they're surrounding.
Yeah.
So.
I showed you that slide there, but y'all can, I just talked about it. So if we go to this next slide, or this next set of notes, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act tried to establish a regulatory structure that made everybody happy, basically made states happy, made tribes happy. But in doing so, and this is a quote from this Judge Canby from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and the Arizona Indian law professor. He said that the Congress basically fashioned a structure that is unique. In other words, there's a regulatory structure here that has never existed before. And it's that thing that you might begin to wonder, is this even possible constitutionally? And again, it gives states authority over tribes, kind of like PL 280 did. It allows states to set boundaries or set regulatory boundaries on the tribes. All right. Now, of course, the tribes have sovereign immunity, and so they cannot be taxed by the state. Right. That's clear. Tribes do have to pay federal taxes sometimes, federal income tax, but they don't have to pay state income tax. And people who are Native Americans who work in Indian country will not be subject to state income tax most of the time. All right. Osage case may have changed that, but California versus the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. In your textbook, it's called the Cabazon Mission Band of Indians, but it's just another typo. It was 1987 when it was ruled on, and the way that it happened, and you have to remember, California is a PL 280 state, so California already had a presumption that it really could regulate some things within Indian country within California, but California it was sort of like California lost big, and that was a win for Indian tribes throughout the country. California established, California was the state that brought suit against an Indian tribe and lost. And it lost big because if you read Cabazon, if you read the opinion on Cabazon, it's sort of like, who was thinking in California? Because number one, California had already allowed bingo to be played, sort of low stakes bingo to be played by charities. The Catholic Church did all sorts of stuff like this. Fraternal orders, clubs, social clubs. California had a state lottery. Okay, California had parimutuel horse racing. California had basically California was making money from gambling, and it tried to regulate the Indian tribes within its state and keep them from gambling. So that's, of course, by this time, I hope you would say, oh, well, that was stupid, right? By this time, you ought to know that that's just a breach of, the federal, that's a breach of tribal sovereignty. The state was intentionally trying to step in to regulate the tribes. Now, the case itself was kind of interesting. In one way, it brought out sort of the reasoning for the IGRA, all right? And basically the state, I don't know if I have notes on this or not. Let me see. Bear with me. Okay, here we go. Here's some notes on the case. So California is a PL 280 state, all right? So California versus Cabazon Band of Mission Indians, 1987. California was, through PL 280, California had authority over criminal law in Indian country. But it did not have civil regulatory authority in Indian country. All right. So this is typical. PL 280 states basically the state highway patrol and the sheriff's office can arrest people when they're in Indian country. Okay, that kind of makes sense. In other words, criminals can't find refuge within a state if they're on Indian land. Okay, so but California did not have civil regulatory authority over Indian country. All right. So the issue then in the case, if you've read the case, the issue was that, was California, when it prohibited Indian gaming, was it attempting to stop a criminal activity, or was it just regulating illegal activity? Okay. And the fact that California basically promoted its gambling operations told the court, well, obviously California is trying to regulate civil regulatory matters where they're not allowed to, and they're not trying to enforce criminal laws. All right. So California lost that one. So criminal prohibitory um, um, considerations versus civil regulatory considerations. Again, it's sort of like criminal jurisdiction and civil jurisdiction have everything to do with the outcome of the case and therefore the building of the Indie Gaming Regulatory Act. So here's some more notes on the case. The Supreme Court gave it a test, and the you can't read this. This is horrible. So does the state of California generally prohibit gaming? No. Does it generally permit it, subject to regulation? Yes. So the Supreme Court, SCOTUS, found California laws to be civil regulatory, and the state had, because the state had its own lottery, it allowed parimutuel gambling on horse races. It allowed organizations to use bingo and card games to raise money for churches and clubs, and then towns in the county, even in the county where around where the Cabazon tribe was, it allowed card games. So it's sort of obvious, that you almost wonder if that maybe the Indian tribe hadn't done this intentionally. It was such a lousy case. All right, so let's go into. Well, this is just more on the actual case. We don't really need to worry too much about that. The BIA, however, did gradually encourage tribes to do things to improve their economic situation. That sometimes, that could be interpreted as use your sovereignty to make money in some way. Use it as a loophole to avoid taxation, state taxation. All right. So back to Class 2, Class 3. What are excluded from Class 2? Well, basically, Class 3 gaming is everything that Class 1 and Class 2 are not. All right. And so Class 3 gaming is anything with a banked game. And again, the Class 3 gaming, so here's the Class 3 gaming. Slot machines, craps, roulette, bank card games. For a game to, or for a casino, for a tribe to be able to engage in Class 3 gaming, it first had to have its own tribal ordinance. It had to be basically what this is part of the IGRA. What the IGRA was doing here is requiring tribes to have consent of their own people first. All right, so essentially each tribe had to kind of poll their own folks to see if this was okay. If we're going to try to engage in gaming, is everybody cool with that? So it had to have Class 2 gaming had to have a tribal ordinance, and it had to be located in a state that permitted such gaming, which most states did. Okay, so and number 2, for Class 3 gaming, you had to have number 2. It had to be conducted in accordance with a tribal state compact, as I've said, and that tribal state compact had to be entered into by the tribe and the state, and basically then approved by the Secretary of the Interior, like everything else in the Indian tribal world. And basically these compacts were kind of cookie cutter, because once they were established, other states just kind of copied them. And this would allow tribes to basically do Las Vegas style gambling. Now in the state of Oklahoma, this is what I was want to talk about. State of Oklahoma, we allowed Class 2 gaming since the very beginning, although the state kind of harassed them for a while. But after the IGRA, it was very clear that the tribes within the state of Oklahoma could certainly do Class 2 gaming, but they could certainly not do Class 3 gaming, because the state of Oklahoma did not have a lottery. It did have parimutuel betting, which was a little iffy. So that what that did, according to the IGRA, is it allowed tribes to also do parimutuel betting at horse races. But of course, nobody did that. In fact, parimutuel betting was kind of going down the tubes at the time anyway, and dying. So that's kind of an interesting facet. So from 1988 until 2004, state of Oklahoma and the anti-gambling forces within the state of Oklahoma, i.e., mostly religious groups, were doing their best to keep the state from passing some sort of lottery measure. Okay. And what do you suppose happened? What was the straw that broke the camel's back that allowed in 2004 that allowed the state of Oklahoma to pass a lottery measure, which is basically a green light for casino gambling on Indian reservations, because a lottery is potentially a big payoff. So, parimutuel betting, not so much, but if the state enacted something new that was clearly betting against the house, and that's what a lottery is, betting against the state, basically, then that would give the tribes a green light to start negotiating compacts. Okay, and there's not much the state had to argue against. Anyway, so what do you suppose it was? What brought on the lottery is my question. Can you all hear Steve, by the way, when he talks? Does it pick him up a little bit? Okay, good.
State needed funding for something.
Yes. What do you think it was?
Schools.
Yes, exactly. So the tribes in Oklahoma have casinos because the state of Oklahoma has lousy schools, lousy public schools, okay? Or at least we don't fund the public schools. So what happened was all these other states that, like Texas particularly, Texas got a state lottery. And when Texas got a state lottery, all that money was headed toward public education in the state of Texas, right? Something like that. Or maybe, other states did the same thing. So, the teachers in Oklahoma were, on food stamps and, not making enough money to get by practically. And the state legislature wouldn't do much at all to increase their salaries. So this came up. It was an easy political fix. So the legislature, said, okay, well, we'll do this lottery, and then all the money that comes into the lottery, it'll go to public education. Well, of course, that never happened. All right, it went to the general fund, and it's not necessarily earmarked for education. But what that did was it put the public, because the public wants good schools, most of the public with children, okay, in the state, they want good schools. And so a lottery, if that's the answer, man, we were desperate. We'll take it. Okay. So the lottery passed in 2004 and I was wrong. And, it did. And it really wasn't even that close. It was clear the people had spoken. They wanted a state lottery and they wanted good schools. And the tribe said, wonderful. You all did great. And they started Class 3 gaming. Now, the argument that California and Oklahoma and all the other states who attempted to, and in Florida, who attempted to stop casino gambling in Indian country, their primary issue was that it would attract organized crime. And your textbook author makes a good argument, sentence or two, about that. And so how would you, if you were arguing for the Indian tribes to have casino gambling, I think this is an excellent argument. Why would organized crime not necessarily be attracted to the Indian tribes' gambling operations. It's a similar question to why would, you know, you can't drive more than a half mile in the state of Oklahoma now and not see a dispensary sign, right? Or the marijuana dispensary place. I don't know how those places stay open, but I mean, there's like 1,000 of them, you know, everywhere. But anyway, it's sort of like saying, okay, well, if you make drugs legal, if you make drugs legal, what does that potentially do? What does that do to illegal drug sales?
Decreases them, in theory.
In theory, yeah, in theory you're taking the market away from the illicit dealers, from the illegal, you're basically opening up a black market to a free market, right? So, in the case of casino gambling, and I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because as I understand it, the dispensary prices are still real high, or the taxes are so high, or something like that, that the black market, the underground, what we could say, the informal economy, is still pretty productive, or something like that. I don't know. I don't smoke. All right, but nevertheless, the casinos, or the states, argued that this will bring in the thugs, this will bring in the mafia, and the casinos argued, and your textbook author says no, because they want to have the most legal, airtight, upstanding, clean operation they possibly can in order to continue to attract more people. So they want to have a squeaky clean reputation in order to keep this running. They don't want to get shut down because they're corrupt. Right? Anyway, I thought that was a pretty good argument, but and I think you can make the point that so far it's been pretty good. There aren't, not that I know of, people money laundering and that sort of thing, and cash businesses. But another thing is, gambling's no longer a cash business, is it? It's all credit. It's all there's not cash much anymore. Yeah. So without cash, you don't have as many bodies. That's a good thing. All right. So anyway,
But also at the time too, the feds were cracking down on organized crime too.
Yeah, and big time in New York. Exactly. That's when John Gotti was going down. So anyway, so maybe credit is the solution here. Well, okay. So casino gambling in states like Oklahoma, and how did that affect the regional economy, the non-Indian economy? Well, Steve, you mentioned infrastructure. State tribal compacts worked it out so that the revenue, some of the revenue from gambling operations, goes to state-sponsored road construction. Basically the state's benefiting from it without doing anything really, because the state doesn't have to enforce. It doesn't have to do law enforcement, and the tribes are doing that. If you drive just down I-244 here from OSU-Tulsa east, you'll come up on one of the biggest casinos in the state. What is it? Heath? Hard Rock Casino, right? Hard Rock, Tulsa. And the interchange to get into that casino as you're going east, that was all built with money from the casino. It was not. Oklahoma tax revenue wasn't used for that, my understanding. Mm-hmm.
And in one of the articles for gaming that, that we're doing a review on. It also said in areas that have, class 3, particularly class 3, it's also non-Indian, income levels have risen, not greatly.
Not
but
spectacularly, but
it's been on the plus side.
it's
Property
increased.
value and other things too. So
Right.
either on a tribal reservation or very close to it, just the income level, because whether they work for the casino or not, a lot of times they're in some way connected to it, whether
Sure.
it's a service provider for the casino.
Sure. I mean, if you own a grocery store, you know, if you own a grocery store anywhere in Tulsa, you're probably benefiting from the fact that hundreds of people, if not thousands of people, work at these casinos around the city. You know, and including, you know, there are a lot of people that come from out of town now. These casinos are big enough that they're entertainment venues, and lots of people come from all around the state to go to see big name music shows and that sort of thing, right? So it's pretty interesting. I have a friend who was the basically the entertainment manager at Riverwind Casino down in Norman, and I mean it's incredible how many people come through there to see the performers, and people will go to the casino with no intention to gamble. Personally, you know, I would go see maybe a show or something, but I would never gamble because I don't gamble. I tried it once and I didn't like it, and I lost $25, and I said this will be the last penny I ever lose to gambling. It was a long time ago. Okay, I was in Mississippi. You know, it was a long time ago, but I don't want to gamble. I don't have any. It doesn't do anything for me. Okay. But I would definitely go see a show. And that's of course going to be, you know, I'm going to be buying gas. I'm going to stop and eat at a restaurant. The economy is benefiting with, you know, what do we call them? Cyclical or, you know, it's a snowballing effect. So it's a good thing. All right. I have even worse notes for you. Here's some stuff on California Cabazon. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act created something called the National Indian Gaming Commission, initially made up of 3 members. But the National Indian Gaming Commission was basically staffed by Native Americans. And what they did was they were from typically different tribes. And they basically were what would you say, an advisory group to Congress, and sort of they were sort of go-betweens between the tribes and the legislators. So they were, you know, that was another thing that the law did was kind of interesting. Just those of you who are geography majors, if you're here in the fall, I know some of you aren't going to be, but if you're here in the fall, we're going to have, and don't repeat this, it might be a secret, I don't know. Our distinguished alumnus for 2021 in the Department of Geography is a gentleman who was a graduate of the geography department same year I was, back in 1989. His name is Tracy Burris, and he's a Chickasaw man, and he is a member of the National Indian Gaming Commission now. A geography major from your department actually is a member of the National Indian Gaming Commission, and actually he's been in gaming since it got started in the late 80s. Anyway, so that he's coming to town. Let's see here. Okay, so we've already talked about this kind of stuff. This is just here we go. and on this, all right, class 1, class 2, class 3, pretty much you've seen all this stuff before. 2004 for Oklahoma, Seminole Tribe of Florida versus Florida, 1996, 11th Amendment, 14th Amendment issues. Okay, here we go. Here's something new. Land acquisitions and historic boundaries. In the state of Oklahoma, we didn't have any so-called reservations. So how did the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act allow tribes to claim territory for casinos or for any sort of gaming operation that was class 2 or class 3? The way that that worked was, in the case of the tribes in Oklahoma that didn't have reservations anymore, or at least we thought they didn't until 2020. There is a census designation called. Well, there's two things actually. In Oklahoma, there's a special one for the state of Oklahoma, and all the rest of the United States has designations called Tribal Jurisdictional Statistical Areas, TJSAs. You ever heard of those? TJSA, a Tribal Jurisdictional Statistical Area, kind of like it's a census designation like a metropolitan statistical area, all right, or a micropolitan statistical area, or a census tract or a census block or something like that. So a tribal jurisdictional statistical area is basically the boundary of the individual tribal reservation or the individual reservation. I shouldn't say tribal reservation because there are so many reservations where there's more than one tribe there. Tribal Statistical Jurisdictional Area, or Tribal Jurisdictional Statistical Area, TJSA. In Oklahoma, we have the Oklahoma, Tribal I think it's Oklahoma Tribal Statistical Area, or, yeah, something like that. So, OTSA, I think. Anyway, we have in the state of Oklahoma a special designation. Because we are special for some reason, or at least we thought we were. We'll talk about Carcieri versus Salazar later. I'm going to bring that up now. But you were mentioning something, Steve, that I actually have done a little bit of work on, and that is how geography has sort of I'll say it, the word that we don't like to say in geography, determined, okay? Geography sort of determines the luck that different Indian tribes have when it comes to gaming, right? So here we are in North Tulsa, and technically the old Cooey district of the Cherokee Nation. So we're in the Cherokee Tribal Statistical Area. And if you walk just a mile down south, or a mile or two, you'll cross the boundary to the Creek Nation Statistical Area. Basically, the historical boundaries of the Creek Nation and the Cherokee Nation. Well, the historical boundaries of the reservations are what the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act used to assign territory to for tribes, or basically allow tribes to claim territory within those boundaries. And the reason I'm getting at that is last time and on the exam, you're studying about the possibility of tribes placing land into federal trust, right? Okay. Now, really, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act is what created that whole process. It's what brought it to the fore, because lots and lots of tribes have these big these big historic boundaries, right? And And we know where those boundaries are, but of course, allotment shrunk all their land away. And so they don't own the land, or that most of that land is not Indian country. Maybe it will be now, but basically it was assumed that most of these reservations were disestablished after allotment. So assuming they're disestablished, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act allows tribes to purchase land anywhere within those historic boundaries and work with the Department of the Interior to place them into federal trust for the reason of gaming. All right. And that, of course, that's a big, big deal, you know. Where are the casinos in the state of Oklahoma? Where are the really big casinos located? You know, there are a couple of good answers. That would be a good question for exam number 3, wouldn't it? What are the factors that go into making a casino operation successful? Geography question here. Well,
Now, such a stuff I think we mentioned within the jurisdiction near a dense populated area,
sure.
and also an access area, whether it be an airport too, if they want to fly in.
Yeah, by an airport, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Or a hotel complex, right, or a convention center, convention complex. Yeah. And in fact, it may be the case that the casino actually brings in the convention center, you know, nowadays. But okay, we have you want as many people as possible, right? Now, how are Indian reservations kind of hamstrung from the outset, the get-go, when it comes to big urban populations?
We push them away.
Yeah, American Indian people are the most rural people in the United States. They also have the lowest life expectancy, the highest rates of suicide and alcoholism and type 2 diabetes deaths. And, you know, the vital statistics for Native people is horrible. It's the worst of any group. But they're also the most rural people in the United States and the most isolated people in the United States. I mean, the whole idea of allotment, you know, if you just take into account marketing agricultural products, the expense of marketing agricultural products, the whole allotment system and allotting of reservations to bring about farming would never fly with Von Thunen, all right, or Walter Christaller, or August Lush, or all those German geographers that, you know, made theory about agricultural market centers and that sort of thing. Anyway, Native peoples are mostly in the rural areas, away from those metropolitan areas that they'd like to have, right? Now, there are some exceptions to that. There are some exceptions like the tribe in Connecticut that I mentioned. Anybody know the name of that tribe? The Mashantucket Pequots. All right, it's a great name. The Mashantucket Pequots were a tribe of fewer than 200 people in the 1980s. Suddenly, the state of Connecticut became very helpful to the Mashantucket Pequots in locating all of their relatives so that they could have federal recognition. All right. Well, I don't know exactly when they got federal recognition, but it hadn't been around a long time. Well, the Mashantucket Pequots are one of the few tribes in the state who survive in the state of Connecticut. They had a reservation. Okay. So anyway, they have a reservation in Ledyard, Connecticut. Ledyard, Connecticut is just up the road from the New York City metropolitan area. You know, 17 million people. And of course, the only other place you can gamble was Atlantic City, but Atlantic City is old and corrupt and all that. So Connecticut was all on board with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. In fact, I wonder if the reason it was even passed was because there were so many possible states that were going to make big time money off of this. Because even if the state of Connecticut didn't receive tax revenue from the tribe, of course they could, through the state tribal compact, they could say, we want 1%. They can set the terms, and they negotiate. So maybe the state says we want 1%, but the state's really going to make a lot of money off of all the people coming into Connecticut for for a tourism venue, and it's going to cause all sorts of other development, which is going to raise the tax base. Not that Connecticut really needs to raise its tax base, but Mississippi and Oklahoma need to raise their tax base. So, state of Oklahoma, you've got all these tribes. Much of the state is covered by tribal statistical areas, basically the old historic boundaries. But some tribes are a lot more advantaged than others, hence inequality. That's what we like to study in geography, spatial inequality, right? So tribes like the Cherokees and the Creeks, the Choctaws and Chickasaws have these broad areas. Many of those areas have interstate and connections with state boundaries. They are bounded with other states. And so naturally, those are the places that are going to be most sought after for casino locations, right? So you have a big Cherokee casino on one side of Tulsa, and on the opposite side of Tulsa, you have another big tribal casino. One's by the Cherokees, one's by the Creeks. All right, and you think about the area. Where do interstate highways leave the state? They leave the state down at I-35 leaves the state near a town called Marietta, and then farther south there's a little town called Thackerville, and the town of Thackerville and Marietta are both smaller than the casino that is there now, which looks kind of like New York City or Rome or Paris, depending on which building you're looking at. But anyway, one of the largest casinos in the world in terms of area is the one down at Thackerville that's run by the Chickasaw Nation, isn't it? Or is it Choctaw? I don't know. I don't gamble. Anyway, and then there's, if you look at the Cherokee Nation, you've got a big casino right at its southern tip at the Arkansas line. So where I-40 goes into Fort Smith, Arkansas, there's a little town called Roland, Oklahoma. That's where you're going to have there's another big casino complex there. And so the tribes put their casinos near cities. They put them near, transportation routes. They put them on the boundaries of each other sometimes to sort of, counteract. Real good geography there, real good marketing geography stuff. Now, the other side of this is that we also have a lot of tribes in the north central part of the state and the central part of the state and the southwestern part of the state, who have very small land areas or very rural areas, not much access to populations. And the way I see it is some of the worst scenario is when you have like a cluster of 3 or 4 different tribes that are all clustered around each other. They don't have much of an ability to if they compete against one another, it's not a good deal. But you do see because of that problem, you see a new phenomenon, and that is several tribes will get together to form a gaming operation that they all have a stake in. Okay, so you see like the 7 clans, is that what it's called? So I think that's maybe just the Otos, though. I'm not sure. So anyway, there are certain tribes that are going to be sort of winners, and certain tribes that are going to be maybe so-called not such great winners in the game of casino gambling, all because of geography and location of the reservations relative to other populations. So, now, it also brings up the, when tribes in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, because it allows tribes to purchase land within their historic boundaries, within their historic reservation boundaries, and place that into trust. You know what they have to do? They have to work through the Department of the Interior, and they have to work with the state where they are, or the city where they are. And if the city or the state doesn't want to cooperate, then most of the time they're not going to be able to get that land placed into trust, because for a casino operation to be legal under the IGRA, it has to be on Indian land. It has to be Indian country. It has to be on trust land. It can't simply be within the boundary of the historic area. I didn't really make that clear earlier. Sorry. So a tribe has to have trust land for the casino. However, they can purchase land anywhere around their historic boundary and then have it placed into trust for a casino if the surrounding areas will abide by it, if the surrounding areas will cooperate and give it an okay. Okay, so tribes have sovereignty, but then tribes have to work with other sovereigns in order to make that sovereignty pay off. Tribes can't just go in and push around the states, just like the states can't push around the tribes. So in that sense, it's kind of a neat facet of sovereignty. All right, that's about it. Let's see if I have anything else to talk about. I think that's about it. Are there any questions on Indian Gaming Regulatory Act? There are a lot of great stories. I didn't supply you with all the stuff on this, but there are a lot of really cool stories about things that happen regarding gaming. For example, those are bogus slides. Sorry. There was an attempt by, who was it? One of the tribes in the northeast corner of the state in Ottawa County, one of those little tiny tribes. I think they had a claim in like Kansas City. It was one of the tribes that had originally been in a reservation in Kansas and got moved down to Indian Territory. Doesn't matter what it is, but they had a historic reservation that was located within Kansas City. I think it was maybe Kansas City, Kansas, I guess. And they pulled a stunt kind of like I said hold a stunt. They tried to do something kind of like what the Oneida did in Sherrill, New York. Remember reading about that? They tried to sort of purchase land, and then without going through the federal government and putting it in trust, they said, well, this is Indian country now because we purchased back our original reservation land, and so it's Indian country. And of course, what happened was, that didn't go over and didn't fly, because they have a way to put it into trust, and they need to do. The federal government requires them to do that. I mentioned the issue about the Muskogee Creek, gaming authority, and how within the Muskogee or the Creek Nation, you have these tribal towns that have their own federal recognition. So they're kind of like nations within nations, and some of them have, I think, like Flopfloco, is that how you say it? tribal town. There are a few tribal towns. I think they actually have their own gaming operations exclusive to those tribal towns. And then you have, I told you about the example in Broken Arrow where the individual was claiming to have, he was apparently a Creek Nation citizen, but he was claiming another identity, another tribal identity, in order to open up a gaming operation. Well, that gaming operation was not something that the city of Broken Arrow was wanting to allow, and the Creek Nation learned about it, and the Creek Nation shut it down and arrested the guy, because the last thing the Creek Nation wants is a PR problem with gaming. All right. So, there's a lot of self-regulation. There's a lot of good reasons for the tribes to, try to make their customer base and the local citizenry, happy. They don't want to make anybody mad. I mean, like the Chickasaw tribe still does those television commercials, that are, I've always kind of wondered, why are they doing this? Why are they spending millions of dollars just to advertise their presence, their existence? And it's a PR campaign. It's intentionally trying to reduce animosity toward the tribes. Anyway, questions? All right, shall we take a quick break? Y'all can go grab something to drink, and we'll come back. And let's cover natural resources / water rights. Okay. All right. at least we're getting to talk about good news nowadays. These are like wins for the tribes. All right, Jarrett and Heath, I can't see you. Are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, cool. All right, let's get started then. Here we're going to talk about another story. I've got a lot of notes here, but the message is mostly about, it's all about water rights, kind of like your textbook. And it's mostly about the West. And it is mostly a story of the evolution of what we call winter's rights. And essentially victories for Indian tribes in the West. But before we do that, we need to talk about, well, let's see here. Okay, now I can do this. In the Western United States, I hope y'all can see that. See if I can zap it up a little bit more for you there. If you can read that. In the United States, we have at least in North America, there were two main sets of sort of laws that affected water rights, okay, rights to water. Now, the United States is a country that has its legal system comes out of England's, and English common law is, what we are used to. In terms of water rights, the English never really had much of an issue with water, so they don't have a very sophisticated system of water rights. The system of water rights out of English common law is just known as riparian rights. Riparian just means along a stream. So basically, if you own land abutting a stream, or if you own land that a stream goes through, basically riparian rights give you all the rights you want to do with what you want to with the water. So you can create a dam and a pond or whatever, lake. Essentially, the English didn't have water wasn't a huge resource. It wasn't a scarce resource for the English. So their legal system didn't have a complex system of doling out water rights. Now in the West, on the other hand, the western half of the United States, and Texas and Louisiana, the Spanish legal system has affected water rights. Okay, now recall back, the United States expanded into the western half of the continent real quickly from about 1845 until 1850. Okay, so the annexation of Texas and the Mexican War and the Adams-Onis Treaty, right? No, not the Adams-Onis Treaty. I'm sorry, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Sorry, got my treaties mixed up. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which basically allowed the United States to annex the western part of the country, and then of course after that, the United States partitioned the Oregon country with Great Britain. So the Pacific Northwest, the Mountain West, Texas, the Desert Southwest, California, all of those came into the Union quickly in the late 1840s, basically, and in early 1850s, California, I guess. and within all of those areas, those settled areas, with the exception of Mormon, Utah, I guess I should say, with the exception of Mormon, Utah, um, most of those areas had legal systems set up by the Spanish tradition, the Iberian tradition, that doled out water rights in a system that we can call the appropriative system. Now, some people will call it the doctrine of prior appropriation. That's one way of that's a formal way of saying it. We can just say it, the appropriative water rights, and that might be a clue as to what that means. So the Spanish system of doling out water rights was respected after the United States took over. Um, the United States didn't come in and say, okay, new rules, everybody, because generally the Spanish system was adapted to dry land areas where water was a scarce resource, was a critical resource to life. And throughout the West, we find, even today, the prior appropriation or the appropriative system of water rights still in effect. Exceptions would be Western Washington and Western Oregon and maybe Northern California, but where you don't have much of a water deficit. But when it comes to all of those agricultural areas in the West that are irrigated, this is actually in play. This is effective. And a lot of activities in the arid western half of the continent, to make a big generalization, many of the economic activities actually require a lot of water. Certainly, agriculture is the biggest user of water, irrigation, but also things like mining historically have required a lot of water. And there are other things that in urban areas, food processing requires a lot of water. Steel making, I believe, and so anyway, you have and another facet of that is in the West, the United States federal government spent billions of dollars in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and 60s building dams. Lots and lots of big federally built dams in the West. And those dams were created mostly for irrigation and for generating electricity, somewhat maybe flood prevention, but around here is all flood prevention and navigation. And but irrigation dams, that reservoirs that were constructed for creating irrigation water for agriculture and for generating electricity to power cities and to power industry, were very important. Of course, now they're recreational assets. So that wasn't really planned. It was just an accident. So the appropriative system of water rights, I'm mentioning this because not only do they provide the sort of initial groundwork for understanding Indian water rights, but the United States government has largely based the most important law or the most important doctrine on Indian water rights. It's really kind of developed it out of the appropriative water system. Okay, so I first got to explain a little bit about appropriative water rights in the West, which here in Oklahoma we don't really understand too much. Only irrigation is only important in the southwestern part of the state of Oklahoma, and that's even going away as cotton becomes less and less lucrative. Okay, so basically, prior appropriation or appropriative water rights have some rules, and that is your rights to the water that comes from a river. It's assumed all comes from a river. your rights to the water out of a river are based on your timing to get there. All right. So the person who, say, built a ranch on the river, or the person who owns a ranch that was built 200 years ago, like on the upper Rio Grande in New Mexico, if you have a ranch that was initiated at that, way back 200 years ago, the rights to the water come with the ranch, or come with the property. All right. And someone who, a ranch that was, or a farm that was established 100 years after that initial ranch, is going to have a lesser claim on the water. They're going to have, well, they're going to be number 2 in line, or number 50 in line. The way appropriative water rights operate, those, if you're not using the water that you are appropriated due to the time in which your property was established, or your water rights were established, if you don't use that water, then you lose a claim to it. So you're not able to claim it anymore. It's what they call a use it or lose it system. Use it or lose it. So here's some more information on the way this works. The rights to water belong to the first user or claimant, who, number 1, claims it, and number 2, uses it. So the use it or lose it doctrine. If a claimant both appropriates or claims water, say for irrigation purposes, and uses it for irrigation purposes, then any later appropriator, say another farm wanting to use water out of the same river for irrigation purposes, a later appropriator cannot take away the water that is appropriated to the older claimant. This applies both upstream and downstream. So if somebody new comes in upstream, they have to allow enough water to get through so that the downstream older claimant has enough water. Following me? Which is kind of interesting. Basically, the upstream person doesn't always win, as they would with the riparian rights. So the age of your claim gives you the priority on the use of the water in the drainage basin. So the oldest claimant wins. The oldest claimant has the most powerful claim. Now, this is important when the river begins to dry up, because in a drought, the latecomers, the people who had the youngest claim, those people are going to not have as many. They're not going to have the rights to the water. The oldest one will. So these water rights have dates attached to them. The older the claim, the more secure the claim during a drought. Now, another facet. So we've got appropriative water rights, okay, and those are in effect in much of the West. Another facet of natural resource law in general is that states in the United States, states generally have regulatory authority over natural resources. There are some exceptions, but mostly states have regulatory authority over water, over oil and gas regulation. Sometimes it's consortiums of states, like the interstate oil and gas compact states. but things like wildlife conservation, hunting and fishing regulation, those are generally state prerogatives. Those are generally states have authority. The exceptions would be for things like waterfowl. Those of you who hunt, you have to have a federal waterfowl stamp every year. Why is that? Well, supposedly waterfowl are migratory. I don't know about you, but I live among hundreds of non-migratory Canada geese, and they're not migratory, but I wish they were. But they're actually protected by federal law. Okay, so you can't harass the Canada geese. But anybody else have that issue? Do they have Canada geese in Enid? We'll bring you some.
They just fly by.
Fly by. Okay.
It's good.
Well, we have resident Canada geese everywhere in Stillwater, and they block the roadways. People stop for them. Anyway, but waterfowl generally migrate, and because of they fly down different like the Central Flyway, they're regulated by not just the United States Fish and Game Service, but actually they're regulated with Canada. So they have a very broad range of regulation, and that's why you got to buy that waterfowl stamp. It's a federal stamp, okay? But generally, states have prerogative on natural resources, including water. Now, most of the state water laws are today sort of, if they're not entirely like Colorado, is almost purely appropriative law. And they take after the Spanish, and I suppose New Mexico also. But other states like California and Oregon are mostly riparian legal systems. So mostly we're talking about the desert Southwest and Southern California, well, Arizona and New Mexico. All right. The most important court case involving that has shaped American Indian water rights is something called Winters versus the United States, 1908. A Supreme Court case involved the Fort Belknap Reservation in Montana. And it's a very interesting story if you get a chance to read about it. Essentially, this reservation was created in 1888 by a formal agreement, wasn't a treaty. And one of the boundaries of the reservation was the Milk River. But that was the only mention of it in the agreement, was that the Milk River will serve as this boundary for the partial boundary of the reservation. Didn't mention anything about water rights in the agreement. So then, after 1888, after the reservation is established, non-Indian settlers move into this part of Montana, and agricultural. In fact, this is actually a paper. We had a colloquium not too long ago, before COVID. We had a colloquium by a fellow who had done some research on this issue or this event. Apparently, J.P. Morgan had, I think it was Morgan, maybe Rockefeller, I think it was Morgan, had invested in these big bonanza farms in these river valleys in the West, and basically taken advantage of Indian allotments. Anyway, that's a different story. So the reservation, people started moving in around the reservation. Agricultural farmers started basically needing irrigation water out of the river. So they started diverting water out of the Milk River upstream from the reservation, diverting that to produce things like sugar beets, which were a big deal up there in the river valleys. So they started producing agriculture in the 1890s. And what happened was they diverted so much, and there's not a lot of water in the river anyway, but they diverted enough of the water that the tribe, suddenly was, they were losing this water. So this claim came about that basically the tribe was complaining that the non-Indians were taking the resource from the reservation. Right. Well, the non-Indians their defense was that, well, the Indians aren't using the water, so we're in an appropriative system of water rights. They're supposed to use it or they will lose it. Okay, that's not in the notes, but the tribe wasn't necessarily using it for irrigation, but maybe they wanted to someday. But the defense of the non-Indians was that, where, basically if you're not using the water, then you give it to somebody else. Somebody else gets to use it. Well, they were upstream from the reservation. So what the court interpreted was that, it didn't need the defense that the tribe wasn't using it. But the way the court, and this is not another one of those strange cases in which during the middle of the allotment period, when the government was trying its best to eliminate tribes as entities, the justices interpreted the Indian reservation as deserving the water, because they interpreted an Indian reservation as just simply, the whole existence of a reservation was to try to have native peoples become sedentary. All right, and this is dealing with the Fort Belknap Reservation, the Gros Ventre, and the Chief Joseph. What was he? Assiniboine? No, Chief Joseph was Nez Perce. But this is Assiniboine and what was the other one I said? Gros Ventre tribes, I believe. And so anyway, the tribes were non-agriculturalists. They were buffalo hunters mostly, and they were up on this reservation. And the way the court interpreted this was, and remember, this is 1908. They're saying, okay, the reservation was established in 1888. That's a year after allotment. Okay, so the intention of the reservation was to get these people to settle down and start acting like farmers, or acting like non-Indians, and farming the land. So a reservation equals agriculture. That's the way the court interpreted this. And if the reservation implies agriculture and farming in this part of the world automatically implies access to water. You're not going to be a farmer in this part of the West unless you have access to irrigation water. So the court ruled in favor of. Let's get a little bit more into the case here. Well, actually, I'm not. That's it, I guess. So basically what Winters' rights did was it established in 1908, it established a precedent for Indian reservations to receive water as a, basically for the reservation to have a great priority for receiving water. Even if they weren't farming and using irrigation water yet, the implication was the United States has established this reservation for people to become sedentary and to become farmers, and so they need to have the water. One of those weird. Oh, guess who the justice was? 1908.
McKenna.
Thank Yakima. What?
McKenna.
Hey, Joseph McKenna. Exactly, Joseph McKenna. Exactly, Sarah. So Joseph McKenna was, this is another one of his home runs for Indian rights, for treaty rights. Now, from 1908 until, and this is where your textbook doesn't discuss this at all, I don't think. From 1908 to 1963, despite this ruling, Indian water rights got basically trampled throughout the American West. Tribes were on reservations, but all around them, irrigation water was diverted or it was dammed by the federal government. And, essentially in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and 60s, and 70s, mostly after World War II in the West, lots and lots of dams were built. In fact, I once heard a famous geographer, who was a water resources geographer. He said, he once asked the question in an AAG, what do you call it, plenary session. He said, does anybody know why we're not building any more dams in the West? And he said, the answer is all the best dam locations are already taken. All right. And so essentially that's kind of true. The locations were the best locations for reservoirs had dams built on. A lot of the Indian reservations, some reservations were impacted by those dams. But anyway, so the federal government spent lots of money building water infrastructure. The whole federal agency known as the Bureau of Reclamation was created during that period. Bureau of Reclamation is the entity that was the federal entity that was basically supporting irrigated agriculture in the West, subsidizing it. All right, so the USACE is the United States Army Corps of Engineers. They also built a lot of dams for navigation, irrigation, power generation, flood control. And the federal courts basically, until 1963, put tribes behind the larger public interest, especially like during World War II and the Cold War. The tribes didn't have really much access to water at all. And so there were, tribal water rights had been set out in 1908, but they really didn't become effective until another court case in 1963. Okay, here are some examples of other water cases. Don't worry about that too much. 1963 brought about this gargantuan litigation called Arizona versus California, but it actually involved lots of states, lots of Indian tribes, and the federal government. So this was a landmark water resources case for American Indians. It was situated, it was focused on water coming out of the Colorado River. And of course, if you think of the Colorado River, what do you think of? What landforms and dams and reservoirs? Any ideas?
Hoover Dam, just a guess.
Hoover Dam, yeah. And there's a really big hole in the southwest in northern Arizona. What's that called?
Grand Canyon.
Grand Canyon, yeah. The Colorado River goes through the Grand Canyon. The Colorado River has been dammed in certain places to create these huge reservoirs. Anyway, the Colorado River. there were tribes located along the Colorado River whose reservation had been established um, both by statute and by executive order. And what this litigation did was it went back to Winters, and it sort of reminded everybody, hey, by the way, there are these reservations out there, and way back in 1908, the Supreme Court ruled that any reservation implied farming, and that farming in the West always implies access to a need for water. Okay, so it held at Winters that any reservation established would imply that government intended farming, and this by nature implies water rights necessary to allow the land to support the people living on the reservation. Moreover, I mean, you think about this, not only did a reservation imply farming, but allotment certainly implied farming, right? And so, if a tribe, and not all reservations in the West actually were allotted. So, some of them were so late that they didn't actually get cut up. Most of them did, but the allotments certainly implied farming. So, in this litigation, rights were reserved for Indian reservations at the establishment of the reservation. Okay, just like the appropriative system, the earlier the reservation, the greater the rights to the water. Well, there became a question. Okay, well, how much water do the people on the reservation get access to? Because all of the other, the agricultural interests, farming interests, basically, were arguing that, these reservations have tiny little populations. They don't need much water, right? But the Supreme Court said no. The Supreme Court said that tribes are entitled to enough water to irrigate all, and this is where we get this term, practicably irrigable acreage. Try saying that 5 times real fast. Anyway, we'll just call it the PIA, okay? Practicably irrigable acreage. Tribes are entitled to enough water to irrigate all of the practicably irrigable acreage on their reservations. So what do you suppose practicably irrigable acreage would imply? If you had a lot of flat land, right, you could potentially irrigate all that flat land. That would be practicably irrigable. Or at least, it's going to have some access to a river, perhaps. So here becomes a geographical question. The Supreme Court's doing this, right? So you have this PIA is a quantitative figure that the court has created. It's a figure that if you have a GIS, you could probably model the practicably irrigable acreage on a reservation. And then basically that means you would calculate what acreage that could be irrigated. That's your PIA. Okay? And that implies how much water you have a right to under the Winters doctrine and under the interpretation of Arizona versus California. All right, so here are some, this is a summary of the Winters character. Y'all can't see that very well. Let me fix that. Okay, so here's a summary of Winters' rights characteristics. Indian water rights reserved for use in Indian country. Number 1, Winters' rights are federal law, and they supersede state law. Okay. Number 2, the establishment of a reservation, whether by treaty, statute, or executive order, includes and implies an implied reservation. What does that mean? The establishment of a reservation implies agriculture, and that implies water rights from sources either within the reservation or bordering the reservation. Can't even interpret my own notes here. So if you have a river running right through the middle of a reservation, well, you can use that or a boundary water of some sort. Number 3, water rights are reserved at the date of the creation of the reservation. So like 1888 in the Fort Belknap case. And if a section is added, okay, we've talked about the IRA, right? In the IRA, they could actually add land to the reservation, and some reservations, got new areas of land, especially in the West, where you had a lot of federal land anyway, and there were private owners to claim it. So, if there was a section that was added at a later date than the initial original reservation, then its water rights start then. Okay. So now we've talked about diminishment, right? Chopping off of a part of a reservation, but reservations also gained territory sometimes after 1934. Competing prior appropriators have precedence over Indian rights if their claim is earlier than the reservation. Make sense? Those with later dates are subordinate to the tribal water rights. Okay, just like the appropriative water rights. There's one catch. What do you think the catch is? The catch is, a couple of them. The amount of water reserved is equal to irrigate all of the PIA, okay, of the reservation. This was later ruled to be the amount, and this is a different case, okay, but it was later ruled to be, quote, sufficient to accomplish the purposes of the reservation, which may or may not be agricultural. Okay. You can, if you have an imagination, you could say, okay, the tribe needs to make money with water parks, or something like that. Or anyway, but number 5 is the catch. Number 5 is, unlike water rights held by non-Indian appropriators, winners' rights are not lost by non-use. That is, they don't have the use it or lose it rule that the non-Indian entities do. So winner rights are a combination of appropriative rights and riparian rights, but they are also, as you might guess, they are rights that the court used the Indian canons of construction to interpret winters, so they gave the benefit of the doubt to the tribes. They also recognized the tribal rights as, they interpreted them as broadly as they possibly could. And so now what that could mean is, tribes have all the water they need in the West. They have unless there are claims that are older than the creation of the reservation, those are okay. But tribes pretty much have as many water rights as you could get. They have an advantage over the non-Indians, which is a new thing. All right, so more notes. You can see the last line the first line is the last line in the last page. In 2001, the Arizona Supreme Court determined that the reservation was intended to be this is really important, okay? really, really important concept here for reservations, and it makes all the sense in the world. Um, Reservations were intended to be the permanent home and abiding place of the tribe. All right. And when that came out in 2001, it really superseded that 1963 Arizona versus California idea that they need as much water as they can irrigate with, you know, ideally. But as the permanent home and abiding place of the tribe, that nullified the whole idea of PIA, because that, in theory, ignores the possibility for the reservation populations to increase, right? It also ignores the possibility for economic development other than farming. This became known in Indian law as the homeland purpose of the reservation, the homeland purpose, and you'll hear more about that. All right, so again, this is real kind of theoretical and abstract, right? But if the government established a reservation for the permanent abiding place of a tribe, and of course we all know that Congress and the American population, when reservations were being made, were assuming Indian tribes were not going to be around forever. They were assuming they would be, disappearing into the ether within a decade or so. If you think about this, if the reservations were really intended to be the permanent abiding place, then you have to also imagine that, well, if their populations don't increase, if they decrease, then there's the government's intended scenario. But if they increase, well, we still got to hold to our promises, right? The populations of a reservation could increase, and therefore they've got to be able to use that land as their permanent abiding place and home. It's not that they can't leave, but a reservation is, after 2001, after 1963, the importance of the reservation and sort of the sacredness even of the reservation is really growing. The homeland purpose, creates a lot of other possibilities with regard to Native American rights. Okay. Any questions there? All right, let's look at an example here. We've talked about the Wind River Reservation earlier. You remember that? The case of the Shoshone and the Arapahoes. The Arapahoes came in and lived on the reservation and didn't ever leave. And the Shoshones took a claim to the Court of Claims. Well, let's go back to the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming again. State of Wyoming, by the way, the state of Wyoming does not have a reputation for being extremely cooperative with tribes. All right, put it that way. Kind of like Oklahoma used to be. The state of Wyoming was generally not very cooperative. And in 1906, or no, this was, when was this? All right, it would have been after 1908, so it's a ruling in which the Wyoming Supreme Court interpreted a reservation's purpose was only agriculture and that water rights included only the PIA. So this would have been after 63, I guess. Maybe this was 2000. Or no, this was, I don't know what it is. All right, so water rights included only the practicably irrigable acreage. And This went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that the purpose of the reservation was to be not limited to agriculture because mining had been used in this reservation. There had been mining operations in the reservation. Anyway, I'm not sure. I must have chopped off the note that I needed there. Basically, what I want you to know here is that reservations were handed sort of superior rights to water over non-Indian entities. And then as the 20th century moved on and we went into the 21st century, the idea of the homeland concept is that you can't just say tribes just need enough water for farming. You need to say that tribes deserve as much water as they might want to use for any sort of economic activity that they want to engage in on their reservation. And a lot of this is just kind of my imagination running wild here, but there are some types of activities that require lots and lots of water, and if a reservation wants to engage in these manufacturing activities, well, it gets the water that it needs for it. This is my favorite example, though, and I think we'll stop at this. This is an example of a tribe that utilized its winter's rights, its extended winter's rights, to practice sort of environmental reclamation, and that environmental reclamation then became a tourism draw. So this is what happened. You know where the Truckee River is? It's up near Reno, Nevada, near Lake Tahoe in California. So the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe, which have a location northeast of Reno, Nevada, their reservation includes all of Pyramid Lake and all of the Truckee River that I guess is connected to the lake, or at least part of it. Their reservation was established pretty early in 1859. It was an executive order reservation. The executive order was affirmed in 1874. So the Paiute got there like in 1859, but officially, it was sort of a question as to whether or not did the reservation get established in 74 or 1859. So it wasn't official until 1874. So the tribe used its rights, its 1859 based rights, to divert water to Pyramid Lake, which saved the lake from the agricultural uses that were diverting it from the Truckee River. So the Truckee River flows into Pyramid Lake, but agriculturalist farmers were diverting water for irrigation, so the lake was drying up. Okay. The same things happen. You know where the Imperial Valley is, Southern California, and where does all the water come from that gets into the Imperial Valley?
Sierra Mountains.
Well, it's actually the mouth of the Colorado River.
Oh, okay.
So, before it gets to the Gulf of California, or the Gulf of Cortez, or whatever you want to call it. But most of the water that the Imperial Valley needs to grow its lettuce for our salad bars is it's so little anymore that a lot of that area is not. It's actually subsiding, I think. Anyway, the tribe basically used its winter's rights, and this was just recently, to bring this lake back to life. And this lake was at one time, a tourism attraction because of sport fishing, because of this species called a Lahontan cutthroat trout. So what the tribe did was they made a lot of farmers unhappy, but they saved this lake, and then they opened it up as sort of a sport fishery again. So conservation wins. The tribes are engaged in conservation, and irrigated agriculture had to find something else to do, I guess. So here's a couple more slides that are just kind of general things to remember about Indian water rights. Because of the Winters Doctrine, right? The Winters Doctrine. Tribes can use water rights to reserve water for conservation under claims for agricultural use. We saw that with the Paiute. Non-Indian users have to use it or lose it and cannot claim water for non-irrigation use, like the Indians can. Reservations command broad water rights because of the federal goal of self-sufficiency and the doctrine of the homeland. Is it the homeland doctrine? What do I call it? The homeland purpose. Homeland purpose. And logically, this is just my imagination running a little overboard. Logically, this should also apply to groundwater resources, and groundwater rights are tied to surface water rights. So Indian surface water rights can help conserve groundwater when states cannot. Now, if you go out to, if you take I-40 out to the Texas Panhandle, you'll find a lot of farmers who are in serious trouble because the Ogallala Aquifer has been pumped so much that the water table has fallen all over the place, and it creates this almost, I guess you could call it a tragedy of the commons, because if you're a farmer needing that irrigation water to grow cotton or whatever you're growing, alfalfa, you have to expend more energy, more fuel to pump the water up so your crops can grow. And that is it's becoming less and less viable as an agricultural area. But there's not really much the state can do to regulate. I mean, the state's already supposed to be regulating it, but it's just kind of a problem that is happening without much of a solution in sight. There are some ideas that you can try to get people to do dry land farming, but it's not catching on that great. So in some states like Oklahoma, where you have large areas of authority, large areas of potential tribal regulatory authority, tribes could perhaps play a role in conservation efforts. Just a thought. And it's very theoretical because in Oklahoma we don't have a lot of irrigation anyway. Okay. That's enough. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm not going to put those up for you. All right. Well, We could go into cultural stuff, but I think we'll wait. Y'all are going to be working enough on the exam, I suppose.